Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the break. Today, we're delighted to have a guest speaker for us, Dr. Bronwyn Tarr, Southern African Rhodes Scholar from 2009. Bronwyn did her DPhil in experimental psychology, the intersection of art, dance, and science. And Bronwyn herself comes out of this actually as a dancer and artist. So glad to have her. Bronwyn helped start a group here at Rhodes House called Rhodes Create, which really helps think about how we might bring our own artistic talents and aspirations together as a community. So we're glad to have her today to speak to us about science and social cooperation. So welcome, Bronwyn.
Thanks so much for inviting me to join your retreat today. As Michael said, I came up in 2009, and my name is Bronwyn, and I worked with Robin Dunbar in the Social and Evolutionary Neuroscience Research Group here at Oxford, which is where I still work today. And our research group is fantastic. We're interested in human nature, big questions about what makes us human, which, from what I understand, is what you've been talking about this morning. So we have people talking about morality in our research group, religion, language, literature, and in my case, music and dance. And the thread that ties together all of these seemingly super diverse research areas is to do with sociality, connectedness, human social networks. So before I was actually a psychologist, I was a zoologist, and I wish I had time to go through all sorts of fantastic examples of other animals, other than humans, that band together in order to solve a whole ton of survival challenges by having safety in numbers and avoiding getting hit by a predator, or in fact increasing their chances of being able to make a kill, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to draw our attention instead to the bottom right-hand corner, to the primate group, the order of primates, which is the category of animals that we as humans belong to. And primates are super interesting because we have really big brains. And that is not an insignificant fact, okay? Brains are incredibly expensive to evolve and to maintain. So Tash over there, her brain, as are all of ours, is only 2% of her body mass, but it takes 20% of her daily energy intake to keep it running, maybe even longer on a Saturday morning in a talk like this. So that's not insignificant at all. And when it comes to primates, it's not just that we have big brains, but that the neocortex, the part of our brain that we attribute to consciousness, to reason, and also to our social ability, it's that part of the brain that is particularly bigger for primates, and also for humans. So why does that matter? Well, when we look at primates, we have very interesting group living arrangements. Lots of other animals live in groups, but in primate groups, we have relationships between people that we're related with, individuals like mother and infant. That attachment is very strong and very important for determining who you're going to cooperate with, who you're going to share food with, etc. We also obviously have relationships to do with romantic partners, right? The idea that we're wanting to try and pass on our genes, etc. But in primate social groups, there's a third category of relationships between individuals, and those are just social. They're not based at all on romantic relationships, and they're not based on us being genetically related to another individual. In humans, we call this friendships, and it's something that all of us as Rhodes Scholars enjoy to an immense degree whilst we're here in Oxford. So those friendships are very important. In primate social groups, it's those social connections that actually determine who you're going to share food with, who you're more likely to have your back in a squabble, who you have general alliances with, will share your sleeping space with. This is true for baboons and all sorts of other primates. So it turns out that the number of those social relationships that you can have is actually predicted by the size of that neocortex in your brain. And this is work by my supervisor, Robin Dunbar, that showed, okay, if you're a marmoset at the bottom there on the right-hand side, you have a reasonably big neocortex, but it's not that large, and you can live in groups of up to, say, 10 individuals at a time. Any more than that, there's too much conflict, and the group splits. Chimpanzees, which are just a little bit above them, they can manage to live in groups of up to 50 individuals, and they have much larger neocortices relative to the rest of their brain. And then there's us, humans. Now, it's a lot more difficult for us to observe natural living group sizes for humans, especially in the modern world. But if you extrapolate this data up, according to the size of our neocortex and how large it is relative to the rest of our brain, it's predicted that the cognitive limit, the number of friends that we can have at any one time, is 150. Now, has anyone heard of Dunbar's number? 150, okay? So that's what this is based on. This is the data that he worked on in the late 90s. And Of course, today we can outsource a lot of our cognitive social abilities to stuff like Facebook and other technologies. It reminds us when it's someone's birthday, what the gossip is, where they're living, who they even are in the first place with photographs, right? So we outsource and we think we can have a whole lot more friends than 150. But according to our brain, 150 is the limit. So those social networks are clearly important to humans, just like they are for any social living groups. And we rely then on that band of tightly, well-knit social groups in order to help us have social alliances, survive. And in our evolutionary past, that would have obviously been important because hunting, building shelter, rearing young is better if we're in a bigger, well-connected social unit and group. So how do we create and maintain those friendships other than through excellently organized Rhodes retreats like this one that we're at today? Well, our primate cousins, further down on this graph, they rely on predominantly an activity called grooming, which is the act of puckering at each other's skin and generally releasing great feel-good hormones in the individuals involved. It's a one-on-one activity. It takes a huge amount of time, but that's how baboons, chimpanzees, monkeys, etc. establish their social bonds. And if I spend time grooming you, you're more likely to help me out in a fight. If I spend time grooming you, I'm more likely to help share food with you. And so your social connectedness and your social networks are nurtured through this grooming process. Okay, great. Grooming is wonderful. Perhaps that's why we all love going to the hairdresser or having someone play with our hair. But clearly, it's very time inefficient because it's a one-on-one activity. So we're sitting up here at about 150. If we were to spend all of our time grooming in order to get there, it would really take away an inordinate amount of time from everything else that is vastly important to our day-by-day existence. So what have humans done? What have we done to avoid doing this one-on-one thing and help us actually get to this much larger social group? So there's probably a huge number of behaviors that help us bond one on many, say 1 on 3 or 1 on 4, 1 on 5, 10, however it is, in order for us to establish and maintain these important social groups. But one behavior, the one that I personally have been interested in, is group music making and dance. So bear with me here, okay? Around the world, there are phenomenal, colorful, diverse examples of people coming together, gathering in order to make music and dance. There is no culture that we know of that doesn't actually invest a huge amount of time in some form or another in these activities. And by definition, they are collaborative in nature. They require people to coordinate their timing, their movement, in order to fulfill what it is that we call music, organized sound, and what it is we mean by dance. So some people have said, yeah, there's really nothing more to that than the fact that we enjoy it. Like cheesecake, there's nothing adaptive to our enjoyment of cheesecake, it's just there and it's pleasurable, so why don't, obviously we're going to do it. But others have said that no, the amount of time we spend doing these activities suggests that actually they must have afforded us some kind of evolutionary advantage, some kind of benefit in the edge, giving us an edge in the survival on the planet. And one way that it might have done that is by helping us forge social connections with each other. And that's the social bonding hypothesis of dance. It's just a theory, okay? But it is quite intuitive. Anyone that's ever done any kind of dancing in any form might admit that it did in fact leave them feeling pretty damn good about the other people that they'd done that with, okay? So we suggest here that dance helps us establish and maintain those social bonds between people that we're not related to, bonds between people that we're not necessarily trying to have babies with, but just generally good, fun, friendship, social bonds. And so with those social bonds comes a whole lot of benefits in our group living environments. We're more likely to cooperate with someone if we feel bonded to them. We're more likely to act pro-social towards them as opposed to antisocial. And as a result, we end up with this tight social group. So the question is how, right? How might this actually happen? What's the mechanisms that's going on when we share a rhythm with each other and we dance together? And in order to get at this question, empirical researchers, cognitive neuroscientists have simplified dance down and said, okay, let's focus on one aspect of dance to begin with. And the aspect that they've chosen is synchrony, the act of doing the same thing at the same time, as demonstrated so aptly by these tap dances. Now, you might not consider yourself a dancer or capable of doing that, and that's okay. But if we simplify this down to just synchrony, then maybe we can get at this question of how dance might have afforded us survival benefits. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to ask us to do a quick activity, which involves you putting down your coffee and turning to the person next to you and taking one hand and placing it on the table between you. Your right hand, your left hand, I don't really care. And I need you to do this in pairs, okay? So if you're alone, I'm sorry. Just watch. All right. Shh. Okay. So what you've got in front of you, are you going to volunteer?
I'm going to do it with you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. This is so good. All right, so we're going to put our hands down on the table in front of each other. Just one hand is fine. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, looking at your own hand, take your index finger and just, as feels good, start to tap out a nice, solid, your rhythm on the table, just with one of your fingers, and you watch it as it's happening. You just start tapping out with your finger, your index finger, and I want you to look down at your hand. Watch your finger do what it's doing. Okay, great. Now I'm going to ask you to look across at your partner's hand. Check out their finger. Looking good. All right, and now it gets better, guys. It gets better. I want you to look up and I want you to make eye contact with your partner. And now look back down, and check out what your fingers are doing. All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. So, very, very quick raise of hands. Throw up your hands if at some point, maybe near the beginning or towards the end, you realize that your fingers were doing the same thing at the same time as the other person. We were, weren't we? All right. Some of us. Excellent. All right. No judgment, okay? That's fine, that's great. Who felt that when that happened, they had done some kind of micro adjustments in order to get in sync with their partner? You might be aware, maybe you're not, but there might be some of us in the room that did that. Okay, excellent. So this act of synchronizing, whilst it doesn't always happen, is often very unconscious and intuitive. It happens without us even intending it to on occasion. And it turns out it's something that we're born capable of doing. If you put on a song, a catchy tune for a baby that cannot yet talk, it will instinctively, before it knows necessarily what it's even doing, start to move in time to the beat of that music. And this is true of babies anywhere, even in the most culturally repressed cultures where dancing just doesn't happen as adults, right? Britain. We have babies capable of doing that. I'm sorry, Mary. We have babies capable of doing that, right? So it really is an instinctive thing. We don't even have to learn to do what we just did with our fingers. And it turns out that scientists that have used variations on the experiment, the little activity that you've just done with your tapping partner, they've discovered that there's all sorts of social effects that even a simple finger tapping can have on the way you feel towards that other person. Now, no judgment here again, all right? But if, in experimental settings at least, we have people tap their fingers in time, in synchrony with each other, as you guys, some of you were doing, then that actually affects the way that those tapping partners feel about one another. They like each other more. They feel more close to them. They trust them more. They also are more likely to cooperate with that tapping partner. And if you were to sit them down after they've tapped in synchrony, as opposed to tapping out of synchrony, if you were to sit them down at an economic game, they're more likely to act pro-socially, to be more generous, to give more money to a public part. Welcome to the world of cognitive science. So what in the world is going on here? How could it possibly be that synchronizing even just your fingers in time with someone else could have this effect? Well, firstly, I must say, it's not just the fact that synchronizing has these bonding effects, but if you already know and like the person that you're engaging in the synchronized action, you're more likely to start synchronizing with them. And so you have this positive feedback loop. Now, I see that there are some people shaking their heads in the audience, so I'm going to demonstrate what is going on here, how it is possible that there might be some relationship between that synchrony and the way we feel towards someone else by a quite famous rubber hand illusion, and I'll talk you through it. In this experiment, we take a participant and we put one of their hands into a white glove. They know it's their hand, it's in a glove. Then what happens next is that hand is moved to the other side of a partition. So they can no longer see it. Obviously, they know their hand is there, but they can no longer physically see it. And instead, a surrogate hand is placed in front of them, a stuffed white glove that looks identical. And what happens next is the experimenter starts to tap and stroke both hands, the one that they can see and the one that they can feel, in sync. And the curious thing that happens is that as this goes on, the participant, whilst they know that the hand that they can see is not theirs, they start to have an illusion of ownership. They start to feel like that is their hand, to the extent that when this happens, they react. You gotta love science, right? So our brains are really fallible, okay? We can trick our brains into acquiring ownership with what is so obviously a glove that does not belong to us. And so the cognitive psychologists that have been working on this have described this emerging of self and other. And so the idea here is that synchrony results in some kind of perception of the self and a perception of the other as merging. And the reason is because when you do the same thing at the same time as someone else, the pathways in your brain that are activated to make you do that movement are co-activated at the same time as you perceiving someone else doing it. And so our brains, just like it's capable of getting confused in that rubber hand illusion, get confused when we're tapping our fingers. And we start to actually see the other person as really being part of ourselves. Yeah, it's worth yawning. All right, okay, so moving swiftly onwards, clearly we've got to move on because finger tapping is boring, and I agree, it's not dancing, right? We're interested here in dance, so how much can we really take from this finger tapping stuff? And also, if we're in a big group like we are right now, how is it possible that just a small synchronized moving actually has this merging of self and other? So to do this and to wake up the folks at the back, we're going to do a quick group activity. For this, what I need you guys to do, please, is to turn towards your table and close your eyes, placing both your hands on the table in front of you. Eyes closed. So, on this occasion, I'm going to take a moment of silence with all our eyes closed. And when you're ready, I want you to start on the table in front of you with your hands to start tapping out your rhythm. A predictable beat. In any time, as you're ready, just go for it. And I want you to go louder, 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 softer, 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 and stop. Eyes are still closed. Eyes are still closed. So you're just sitting here, we're relaxed. When you're ready, I want you to do the same thing as we did before. Start to tap out. Softer. And louder. Okay. Open your eyes. All right. Thanks, guys. So, what happened there? All right, so I put on a piece of music which didn't necessarily make us all start synchronizing, but there was a notable difference between the total random noise that occurred before we had the music on and the somewhat sense of more conformed tapping that happened when there was music. Now, that works better in some groups than others, and maybe by the end of the retreat, you guys will sync better. Challenge accepted, okay? But what we're talking about here is the fact that music is a very powerful stimuli, right? Remember the babies that we saw earlier? When we put music on, it actually activates, even if we're trying to sit still, the areas of our brain that are involved in movement. And so normally you can't even help but move. Now, those that were not in sync with the music may have been trying not to be because they wanted to be an individual and tap out their own beat, but that took active effort, all right? It is actually quite hard to not get in tune with music when it's playing. even if you're not musical, right? Remember the babies, okay? It's actually something very intuitive that we can all do. So when we're in a big group, and remember this whole thing is to do with big groups, we're trying to figure out how is it that we might be able to bond large groups at any one time. Well, it might be that coordinating such a large group like the 100 of us in here is quite tricky, but if we put on music, it acts as a rhythmic scaffolding. So there's a third thing in the room, an extra thing that we can all attune to and get in time. And as we already see, Synchrony has all these positive effects. So if we do that, if we engage in this group music making or dance activity, then that might be able to help us experience some serious social bonding, as we see in flash mobs or in massive Zumba classes, for which there was meant to be a video there, but I'm sure you know what I mean. So when a bunch of people move together like that, then it might have these very strong self-other merging effects. Now, finally, we get to my research. I'm interested not just in that cognitive effect of oneness, but I'm interested in the hormones, the neurological chemicals that might be underpinning and relating to it. And so this is an additional element to our understanding about how dance might bond us. And it's to do with the fact that dance, we suppose, releases various chemicals in our brains that results in that social bonding and that closeness that we feel. So I'm interested in endorphins. Everyone here has probably heard of the happy chemicals that are endorphins. You go for a run, they're triggered. More endorphins in your system means you feel good, you have this euphoria. It's called runner's high for a reason. You can even get addicted to it, right? And it also increases your pain threshold, and that's because endorphins are part of our pain and our pleasure circuitry. And so in a lot of the experiments that myself and others do, we can't measure endorphins directly, but we just take pain threshold, the increase in your ability to take pain, as a proxy measure of endorphins being released. Now, this is the fact that, okay, who here rows? Raise your hands. There's some, okay, respect, especially in winter. It turns out that if you do your exercise in synchrony, as you might in rowing, as you try to in rowing, then in fact that increased pain threshold effect is even stronger. So whoa, there is actually something about synchronizing, not just exercising, that activates this part of the brain that releases your endorphins, your feel-good chemicals. Now, why do we care about this in a discussion of social bonding? Well, our primate cousins, when they're doing their little grooming thing, are experiencing elevated endorphins in their systems. And we know that because people have cruelly given these animals drugs that block the endorphin system in their brain, and that actually affects their social behavior, their grooming behavior, and the high that they can get from it. Ergo, we think, endorphins are underpinning the social bonding that happens when these animals are grooming. And so, it may very well be the case. When we're dancing together, we know we're exerting ourselves, and we're synchronizing. It seems as though both those two things together combine to give us an endorphin kick and a high. So that's the hypothesis that I set out to investigate in one of the studies that I'm very, very quickly going to take you through. I did this study in Brazil. It's been recently published in Biology Letters. The title there gives away the findings. But because it looks kind of cool, I'll take you through how, from a scientific perspective, we might try and understand this question of the way that dancing gets us to this social closeness. So I had bunches of 3 participants in Brazil come in. They were high school kids, and they did already know each other, and we allocated them to one of 4 movement conditions. We were interested in manipulating both their synchrony, whether they're doing the same thing at the same time, or non-synchrony, if they're doing something out of sync. And we were also interested in manipulating that exertion, right? That fact we know that exertion plays a role in releasing endorphins. So we had them do stuff standing, and we also had them do the movements in a low exertive state. So to demonstrate this, with their permission, I show you some quick videos. So sick of this music. So these guys are exerting themselves, they're standing, and they're doing the same movements at the same time. Okay, so that's our high exertion and synchrony condition. The next is our non-synchrony but still high exertion condition. You'll see that each student is doing a different movement at any one moment. They're all exerting themselves, but they're not in synchrony. Science. All right, and the final one here, we have a low exertion condition. These guys are seated. They're clearly not exerting themselves hugely, but they're doing the same thing at the same time, like our tapping fingers, right? Small movements, but in sync. And our final movement condition, and remember, each group was randomly assigned. They had no idea what they were going to get or what the other options were. These guys were doing low exertion, and they weren't synchronizing. All right, so all of that happened in the Amazon in the middle of Brazil. And what we were interested in doing was measuring before and after they did those movement activities that you've just seen. We wanted to know what is their natural, their resting pain threshold. So we took a blood pressure cuff and we attached it to their arm, we inflated it, and we saw how much pressure can they take. Then they did their movement activity, and afterwards we did it again, and we could see what was any change in their pain threshold. Remember here, pain threshold is our proxy for endorphins being in the system. We also had them answer a whole battery of questions to do with their social closeness. How much did they trust the other participants? How connected did they feel to them? How one did they feel? How fused was their sense of identity with this group? And they did that before and after the activity. So I'm going to quickly rip you through the results. I was told to keep graphs into this talk, and I hope that you'll bear with me on this. The first thing is obvious. If people were exerting themselves, if they were doing the large movements, then their pain threshold went up. So the guys on the left were higher overall in their change in pain threshold than the guys on the right who were seated and doing low movements. That's not surprising. We know that running gives us an endorphin high. Okay, great. But it turns out that synchrony has that effect as well. So, like with rowers, when people were exerting themselves and synchronizing, they had that high, very high increase in pain threshold. But even in that task that we did earlier, when we were just tapping our fingers in time, according to these results, even that low exertive synchrony is going to cause your endorphins to be elevated, which I found pretty phenomenal. Who needs to go for a run? All you need to do is tap your fingers and sync with someone. And as I said, if you're hanging out on the left-hand side here and you're combining both of these things, you're exerting and synchronizing, then you have the greatest effect. Now, what about social closeness? We're not just interested in endorphins, right? It's all about social networks. Well, once again, if you had exerted yourselves, if you had done large movements with your partner, then you felt closer towards them compared to if you hadn't done that large standing movement. And once again, as we expected, if you'd done the thing in synchrony, it also had that effect. So both synchrony and exertion are having these positive effects. Those poor guys on the bottom right-hand corner, they weren't exerting themselves, and they weren't in synchrony. So those are those of you that didn't end up in sync with your tapping fingers. No change in how you feel towards each other. Don't worry, it didn't drop, but no increase. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that, let me turn that down. If you have a highly synchronized and exertive experience, like, say, a massive Zumba class, then you're likely to get the best kick you can for your endorphin system and also for your social closeness that you might experience with those present. And so music affords us this wonderful opportunity to synchronize with others, but also to get us moving in a highly exertive way. And this might be why people actually bother with large-scale Zumba classes and flash mobs, why they love them at all in the first place. And this, like I said, is one experiment of a whole range that has helped us understand the relationship between dancing, which can be synchronized and exertive, the release of endorphins, and then the social bonding that might arise. And so I would also say that there's, of course, the idea, our social groups, is this really just a nice just so story about our evolutionary past, and indeed it very well might be. But our social networks are incredibly important. Our sense of community, established by any means, whether it is that mass Zumba class or not, it plays a huge role still today in our survival. People love this study. A meta-analysis was recently done on your chances of dying and your social relationships. Now we know that smoking, obesity, not getting any exercise, generally living an unhealthy life reduces your life expectancy. But it turns out that not just does smoking kill, but so does social isolation. Now, it's a lot more complex in understanding why, and I'm not saying that in order for you to live a long and healthy life, you should dance a whole lot more, although in my opinion, you should. But what we're seeing here is still today in a world where we plug into our private music devices, and in fact, our engagement with music isn't necessarily the social participatory experience it used to be. We still have within us the ability to synchronize even our fingers tapping in time with others. And that is one of the many human behaviors that we resort to in our evolutionary past and still today in order to feel good about ourselves and to trust others. And so, to finish off, I would say, please dance on your own, but better yet, with others. It's something that we've inherited from our musical ancestors as an innate capacity, the ability to maybe not do it well, but to just lock into a beat and move our body in time to it. And when it comes to talking about human connectedness, social groups, social networks, it seems to be one of the beautiful ways that we help maintain and also in the first place establish those social connections. Thank you.
We have time for questions. So questions for Dr. Tarr.
No. So any questions? If there are none, I have some other cool slides to show. Yeah.
We have open space later. Would you be willing to lead us in a dance?
Oh, undoubtedly. In fact, I normally start this talk with a dance, but I thought a Saturday morning that would be unfair. But yeah, after the talk, I've got some good tunes on here. Keon.
Thank you, Dr. Tarr. Very nice. I appreciate it. If we could go back to your last graph that was on social inclusion. So when I look at it, it looks as if the means for the synchrony in high exertion and synchrony in low exertion are fairly overlapping. It's only the partial synchrony in low exertion that isn't. So does that mean that we don't need to exert ourselves at all to get these effects? That as long as we're synchronized, doing something relatively minor in that case?
Yeah, so according to this, so the question was, there's no difference between the three averages that we see on the left. It's really just the trends are being driven in this case by those guys on the far right-hand side who just are getting no social benefits at all from not exerting themselves and not synchronizing. So Keon asked, do we need to exert ourselves in that case? Or can we just synchronize in order to feel socially close? And according to these results, yes, you don't need to. But the curious fact here is that if you're going for that endorphin high, there really is an effect of doing both. So this also then begs the question, how does that endorphin high actually relate to that social closeness? And that's still a really interesting area of ongoing cognitive neuroscience and behavioral research. But yes, you don't actually have to exert yourself to feel closer to each other. And this actually is great, because if you think about people that aren't capable of moving their whole bodies and exerting themselves, that doesn't mean that they need be denied the experience of being able to connect with someone else and establish those social closeness effects. And indeed, even some endorphin boost. So dance movement therapy taps into this perfectly. People that are immobile can even do a small movement with their hands, and that kind of therapy session can drastically improve their ability to handle pain and also the way that they feel about the group that they're working with. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It was fun and interesting. Just a question. How sustained is the feeling of closeness? How often do you have to boogie to feel close to someone? And have you seen if it translates to something beyond just like labor market outcomes or something else?
Oh, there's an opening in our lab. If you want to come, I don't know what you study, but there are so many questions, and you've just highlighted three really good ones there. The first is, we don't know how long the effects last. We know a little bit about how long endorphins stay pumping through your system, but the social benefits, we actually have no idea. I didn't show the result here because there wasn't time, but we actually asked all of those social questions in relation to the people that they'd done the dancing with, and also in relation to their school class, the guys that weren't there. So the thought was, is this a general sense of, oh, I love life, and I love the world, and I feel positively towards anyone that I know? Or is this targeted? Is it to do with the in-group that you've had this experience with? And there was actually no difference in our study between those two findings, which meant it really is about participating in the experience that can have these effects. But that is still something that needs to be better investigated. How long those social effects last, we're not sure. And your final question was?
How many, maybe it's not too separate, but
Oh.
how often you have to boogie to
How often you have to boogie, right? And that's related to how long the effects last, and we have no idea. And in terms of if it has actual real effects, in terms of how people act in the real world, well, actually, you've just hit on the hidden secret in this area of research, which is that we have no idea how to really capture that sense of connection that you guys at the end of this weekend are going to leave with. How do you really measure that, right? You already knew each other to some extent, but by the end of this retreat, the feeling of connectedness and closeness, the trust that you will likely have opened up and formed with other people in the group, that is something that is quite difficult to measure in a robust and predictable and meaningful empirical way, right? And we have lots of ideas, and in this study we just asked people how they felt. But of course economic games and all sorts of other measures of pro-sociality have been thrown out there as other ways of getting at it. I'm dissatisfied by all of those mechanisms. And so it still does kind of remain a bit of a mystery. What is actually the essence of that feeling that we will leave with at the end of this weekend? Yeah.
Does the type of dance matter? The reason I ask this question is in my student days, I used to do ballroom dancing at the university dance thing, and that wasn't a good learning experience. There was a desire to win, took all the joy out of it, and there was a lot of unhappiness in it. I'm wondering if group-based folk dancing is more suitable to this move. Does it work with couples dancing, or is it just a competitive nature of obstacle?
I mean, yeah, I think you should have tried the Salsa Society. Hey, I'm just joking. Shameless plug. It's great. No, so, I mean, you make a great point, right? Not all dancing is equal, and not all dancing involves perfect synchrony, but in the case of ballroom, you're coordinating your behaviors with someone else. Something like tango is a very fine-tuned form of communication and coordination between your partners. And if you and your partner don't already like each other, or aren't open to liking each other, or are in a highly politicized, competitive society environment, then it's more likely that that sense of positive bonding that could arise anyway will be perhaps challenged and hindered. But I think the principles still remain. If you had a good dance partner, then the locking in of that ability to just understand and synchronize with someone else's body without even having to communicate, and I'm looking at Keon because he was my best dance partner ever, it really has a very strong effect. And from the reading that I've done and just as a dancer traveling around talking to people, I'm always curious what their experiences are. And it's not limited, I don't think, to any one type of dance.
One more question.
Oh, there's so many.
Over here.
Yeah.
So that's the first part. Second is the one with the hand exercise. I just had my hand on the table and I flinched. So it didn't even have to feel like my hand. I still flinched because it was horrific. So I'm wondering how much do you actually have to feel like it's your hand to immediately get it?
Yeah.
And the last one. There's a lot of promotion in this for kind of fitting in the way that you fit in. What's the negative part of the study? What are the negative findings of synchronization?
Okay. So the very first question, so hard for my memory. So I'll just go with the ones that I remember. So the fact that you knew your tapping partner undoubtedly plays a big role in the way you act around her. And welcome to psychology, okay? So when we're trying to do these experiments with people, we're dealing always with the fact that humans are very good and enjoy thinking and overthinking and really, we call it demand characteristics often. If you give them any sense of what the thing is that you're trying to do, often that can influence their behavior. And so in these experiments, we're trying to trick people into not overthinking and taking liberties or whatever. And so we tend to do our experiments with people that don't know each other in order to avoid that. And so these findings are very strong with people that don't find each other. I haven't personally compared if the effect is as strong when people already know each other. The data I showed you today was with people that did already know each other. But we were looking at the change, and they, unlike in our tapping experiment, they ended up synchronizing by virtue of how the experiment was set up. So it wasn't just a matter of like, maybe they synchronize, maybe they don't. We were inducing synchrony to then measure the effect that it had. But you make a very good point there. In terms of the negative sides, this is not totally related, but I'd like to show you. Synchrony plays a really big role, not only in helping you formulate that social closeness, and as you say, we're very susceptible to our brains being activated when we even just see, if not experience, some kind of synchronized activity. But a recent study drew on the fact that when you do something in synchrony, it doesn't just result in the strong social group, but once you have a strong social group, you can advertise that. You can signal that out to the people that are watching you. And I love the example of the haka here, because New Zealand is undoubtedly the best rugby team in the world, and I'm sorry to the South Africans in the room. And one of the reasons, in my humble opinion, is because they do the most terrifying synchronized ritual at the beginning of every single international game. And that is an inherited Maori haka dance that warriors would have done before they went into battle. And so the act of synchronizing in this instance doesn't just bond them together and make them feel like they are a strong, formidable unit, which they clearly are, but it also signals to their opponents that they are a strong and formidable unit, so be warned. And a recent study found that psychologically, if you even march in step with someone, and in the case of the study, you are a man, but I doubt that it would be any different for women, if you synchronize your steps with someone and you then are met with the image of a potential foe, your assessment of how worried you should be about that foe, the formidability of that potential enemy, is far diminished. Safety in numbers. So synchrony is having a very positive effect for you as the synchronizer. But when it comes to the person facing the New Zealand rugby team, maybe there's some serious negative effects on their psyche that they might experience.
Let's synchronize and clap for Bronwyn Tarr.